I'd like to welcome everyone to our lectionary Bible study. Our text today are for the 17th of January 2021. The first text that we have will be 1 Samuel 3. The lectionary says we should use verses 1 through 10 with 11 through 20 as being optional, but I think we're going to use the whole thing today because it's an important story and it opens, in a way, a new chapter for Israel. At this time, Samuel will be the last judge that rules over Israel, and by the time that Samuel's life is over, there will be a king, first Saul, then David, then Solomon, and then a run of other kings of Israel or Judah. And so we start today, and by the way, for those of you that are watching from different locations, Saladow's a town in Texas, a village actually is what we call it, which is about halfway between Waco and Austin. And so just so you know our geographical locale. As we start the first lesson from the Hebrew Scriptures today, we are in Shiloh, which is one of the places of worship in Israel in these days. This was before Jerusalem was to be made the capital, which would happen in a couple of generations, or a generation and a half anyway, when King David moves the capital of Israel from several different locations to a central location and a central sanctuary, which is in Jerusalem. So we begin. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. And just to catch you up on the first couple of chapters of 1 Samuel, Samuel had a mother whose name was Hannah. And Hannah had a lot of problems because she was one of those persons who was, as they say, barren. She didn't have any children. And so she goes to the temple at Shiloh, and she prays to God that if God will give her a child, because she had pined for a child for a long time, and her husband's other wife was able to give him children, and so she wanted to do the same thing. This was probably a little bit different culture than we live in today with respect to giving men children as wives and so forth, or at least we talk about them differently. But Hannah had prayed, and once she conceived and had a child, and by the time he was weaned, she lived up to her end of the vow that she had made to God, and she took little Samuel to the priest that lived there and ran the temple. His name was Eli. And later on in the story, you'll find out that Eli had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they were both more or less wicked and evil and really money grubbers. And so God will wrest away the priesthood from Eli's family and reestablish it with Samuel. So the boy went. He was fairly young, as the story indicates, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. In other words, either God did not speak to God's people as he had previously, or at least with the same intensity, or the people did not hear God when God spoke to them, and visions were not widespread. So it seems like God's word dissipated among the people, and of course for folks that were religious in every sense of the word as the Hebrews were, this would create a problem. Then it tells us at that time Eli, whose eyesight begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. which means that this was probably in the middle of the night, and eyes growing dim is a suggestion that Eli is getting a little old and will soon have to turn over his priestly duties to his two, we know, worthless sons that he has. Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. He probably slept where the lamps were, so he could make sure that they continued to burn. Then the Lord called. The word of the Lord now is becoming not rare. Samuel, Samuel, and he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Because Samuel was fairly young, he heard a voice calling him. He just naturally assumed it was Eli calling from another room where Eli was resting or sleeping. But he said, that is, Eli said, "I did not call, lie down again." So he went and lay down, that is, Samuel, the small boy. The Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, or the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. What this is to tell us is that Samuel was a young, naive boy growing up, and there were many things that he had not yet learned, and this is one of them. Then the Lord called Samuel again a third time. And you remember that in famous call stories, we often see that God calls 3 times to people. This happens in various stories in the Old Testament. We hear Isaiah speak that story and so forth. So he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." This is the 3rd time that this has happened. Then, at this point, there's a turning in time, and suddenly Eli realizes what the occasion is. And so it says, "Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, 'Go lie down. If he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" And so Samuel would, of course, be a servant. And so this is the time when the divine voice breaks through and will make contact with this young boy, Samuel. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And in verse 10, it tells us, "Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, and this next part from 11 to the end of the chapter is bad news for Eli, but it's good news for Israel, because we will have a new prophet or priest, you might say, in the land of Israel that will be attuned to the word of God, or to Yahweh's voice. And the interesting thing about Samuel is he's not only serves the function of judge and kingmaker, but he is also the chief religious officer, I guess you might say, in the land of Israel. And so he is like the chief of all priests in Israel. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears it tingle." Now, when the ears tingle, what this means is there is a word that's going to come that is going to change the course of events. Things will be altered. Tingling ears mean that they hear a new word. Sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good. In this particular case, it's bad for some and good for others. On that day, I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, that is, Eli and his family, from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. In other words, we've heard in the Bible about the punishment of the children for the sins of the father. Here the father is being punished for the sins of the children or the sons, and he did nothing to restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli, and the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. In other words, it will never be forgiven. Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. He had a lot of respect for Eli. He loved Eli. He was one of Eli's favorites, and he was raising him as if he was raising his son. So Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli because he didn't want to disappoint him, or he was afraid of an angry reaction. He may have even thought that there might possibly be violence. But Eli called to Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son?" And he said, "Here I am." And Eli said, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." In other words, he said, that is, Eli told Samuel, "Don't be afraid to tell me the truth. I need to know. Please tell me what the vision or what the word was about that you received from the Lord." That's what he's saying. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And basically the message was that Eli's house was going to be obliterated, and evidently that's what Samuel told him. Then Eli said, "It is the Lord." So instantly he realized where the word came from. It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. And so in this way, Samuel's mentor proves that he is much different from his sons Phinehas and Hophni, who were really wicked and evil and did bad things in the sight of the Lord. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. That's a Semitic way of saying not a word was wasted. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. In other words, his reputation went before him. And then it tells us that the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh and so forth. This is a really important character that we're being introduced to as moving from childhood to adulthood. We met him when he was born as a baby in the first 2 chapters, but this chapter tells us that he was especially anointed, and he had special prophetic powers that a normal human being didn't have. And before his career is over, he would be the kingmaker who chooses Saul as the first king, and then later will go to Jesse's house near Bethlehem, and he will choose David as Israel's second king. And so he becomes a very, very important character. Now I would invite you to flip over to Psalm 139, one of the most well-known and probably the most beloved of all of our Psalms. Obviously, Psalm 23 takes the cake for that, and yet at the same time, Psalm 139 is one that really shares 2 basic premises. The first is that God is so powerful, so ever-present, so creative and joyful that all creation springs from his particular word. The second thing that it tells us is that human beings in and of themselves with their finite minds are really not capable of either imagining God as God is or articulating what they think about God, because God is so awesome. And so let's look at the first 6 verses of Psalm 139. And here is what it says. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. And I want you to notice as I read these 6 verses continuously, the number of personal pronouns that we see. Me, my, I. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down. You know when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all of my ways. Even before the word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in before and behind me and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Now, I haven't counted how many of those personal pronouns there are, but there's a bunch. There's one in each verse at least. And it tells us several things. Is when the Hebrews say, you know when I lie down, you know when I rise up, it means God knows everything about this person. You know my thoughts. God knows what we are thinking. So the idea is that this God is all-knowing. He's omniscient. And that could really be intimidating to people. It's like sometimes along the South, especially in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, you go into these small country churches sometimes, and in many of them, I don't know if it's still true, but it used to be true 30 or 40 years ago and even before that, where there will be a picture on the wall in the worship area, often called a sanctuary. Some churches call it an auditorium, but there will be one big frame picture of one eye looking at you. I think that's probably also on our dollar bill, one eye. And that eye represents seeing all, and what sees all knows all. And that's the kind of feeling, kind of atmosphere that we get from these first 6 verses. Then we look at verses 13 through 18, and this is why people should not fear this kind of knowledge of our inner being. Most of us spend a lot of time trying not to say things that we're thinking at the time. It's just dangerous to social relationships. And so it says, for it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Jeremiah will say something very similar to this when he's talking about his own call. But the idea here is that God doesn't just peer into our lives. He doesn't just spy on us to find out all of our faults. What it does mean is that God cares for us so much that God is with us at the very beginning. Knit me together. What that means is that God fashioned me, shaped me, made me, molded me. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And this just means that what God has done for each of us is awesome. This fearfully means something like awe-inspiring, like the fear of the Lord really means the respect of the Lord. Wonderful are your works, that I know them very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. And depths of the earth here probably means in my mother's womb. It's another sort of Hebrew expression that is used. And what he is saying is that God made him from the very, very beginning. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. And that reminds me of Genesis 1, where God takes this formless void and he makes out of it our creation, the earth, separates the land and the water, the light from the dark, and so forth. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I tried to count them, they are more than the sand. I come to the end, and I am still with you. That's an interesting phrase, and it ties this part of the psalm together. God was there at the beginning when he knit the parts together of the man or the prayer or the one who wrote this psalm or sang it. And also it tells us now that I am still with you, God, even at the end. And that means either the end of his life or the day of the Lord when the final judgment will come. But for whatever reasons that you read this particular psalm, it is a reminder to each of us that God was with us at the beginning and the end, and that we can therefore assume that God is with us at all times, in all places, and cares for each one of us as individuals, and of course cares for us as a people, as an ethnic group, as a nation, as a tribe, as a world. And so I'd like to thank you for being with me today, and I look forward to speaking with you at the end of the week, where we will look at two texts, one from 1 Corinthians, the second one from the Gospel of John. So thank you very much.